Welcome back to Inside the Pastor's Study Podcast. My name is Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And we are coming on back to you on a Tuesday. It was a holiday weekend. We warned you a few podcasts ago that there would be some of these weeks coming up here during the summer where Mondays were just hard to get into the studio. So we've continued our conversation here on a Tuesday, and we're talking about the church right now. We're talking about the history of the American Protestant church. And we've been going through this arc. We started talking about it way back with Christopher Columbus in episode 3, I believe. And now we're here, and we've made it all the way through the 1980s, really is where we were leaving off in our last episode, where a lot of things start to happen. So we start with this American Protestant movement, which is a very unique thing in church history, that you have a brand new country being founded largely out of its experience with a kind of an emerging faith. So both of those things develop around the same time together in the American experiment and the Protestant church. And they kind of grow up together in this great lab for both politics and religion. And out of that movement and out of some of these new denominations that we've talked about come out of the melting pot of nations that come into the United States, you have the Protestant movement, which grows and flourishes. And over time, out of that, you then get something that we've called the Evangelical movement. And the Evangelical movement, we've said, is rooted largely in the fundamentals of the faith that came out of Chicago. What year was this again?
Are you saying in 1923, the Fundamentals of the Faith by J. Gresham Machen?
Right. So that's the one big step in the evangelical movement, and then after that, you have this doctrine of inerrancy that gets refined and published out of Chicago. That was the
Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, 1980. I think it was 1986, somewhere about there.
Sure. So that is kind of our arc that really begins to define evangelicalism as a movement within the Protestant church, and you have. Now, there are evangelicals as broader than just one denomination, but it is a mindset among denominations, and you have certain denominations that kind of fill in that hole more than others.
Right.
You know, you could technically call even some Catholics an evangelical Catholic, but that's rare. But when you think of the evangelical church, you're tending to talk about a lot of non-denominational churches. We've talked about where those come from. That's a few episodes ago, and some community churches like ours. You have a lot of Baptist churches that would fall into that evangelical line, and there's others too.
So there's a very interesting website that you might consider going to.
Resources,
and
fun.
That's it's called the Pew Research Study on Religion. I think it's pewforum.com, and PEW has nothing to do with church furniture. Has everything to do with
or a cartoon skunk.
Exactly, it is has everything to do with a very conservative family in the 1950s. Pew was a big supporter of Dwight Eisenhower. Interestingly enough, his research company today is Pew Annenberg. Both of those people were very conservative. Most of their work today is being done for liberal causes, which is pretty crazy on a political spectrum. But the Pew Research Center does an annual religion study. And if you go into that Pew Research website, they actually break out how many people in the United States consider themselves evangelical, how many people consider themselves mainline Protestant, all the way down to, the end of the list is not connected or atheist. And right now, for example, 25% of the population of the United States calls themselves evangelical Christians. And if you hit the little caret next to that on that website, it will define many of the church denominations that we would call evangelical.
There you go. Okay, so if you're curious about playing around with that and learning a little bit more.
Yeah, actually, very interesting site to go to.
Yeah.
And just, it gives you a good insight. I know, for example, one of the things that has made a lot of headlines in the last 2 or 3 years is that only 75% of the population of the United States considers themselves Christian now. And they make a big deal in that conversation about how, there's the number of people who consider themselves not religious is about 25% of the population, which is a pretty startling number. 20%, I think, is what it is. But when you dig into that number, what you find is that only about 8% of the population could consider themselves atheist or agnostic, which is a number that has not changed in almost 100 years. But what you do have is you have a lot of people who have become disenchanted with denominationalism. They've become disenchanted with the message of the church, and they classify themselves as none. They don't identify anything spiritual in their lives, although in saying that they're none, they have not gone to the place where they've actually denied the existence of God.
Yeah, they've just denied their church involvement.
Exactly.
They're no longer interested in being involved, which, I think as people see studies like that, they start to ask that question that has been the root of this conversation. It's because, the assumption is that these nuns are increasing because they are disgusted with all of the division and divisiveness within the church. And so they would rather just not have anything to do with it. And they remove themselves from churches altogether. And people look at research like that and say, well, then in order to fix this, we need to make sure that all churches get along. And if we can get all churches to get along, and if we can get over ourselves and regain fellowship, and start looking at each other as brothers and sisters, all headed to the same place in heaven, then if we can get there, then some of these nuns will be moved by the brotherhood, the sisterhood of that new movement, and would find themselves back in church.
Right.
And so asking that question, like, how can we get to a place where as churches we all get along again? And can we get past denominationalism? I think a lot of times is rooted in this heart for people who have wandered.
Right.
And the hope is that we can find some of those lost sheep again by getting along again.
Right.
Which I don't mind that thought process, but I think I'm hoping that as you've listened to our podcast over the last several weeks, they're hearing that some of these divisions that have happened over the years are good.
Yeah, they're meaningful.
Yeah.
Right? So there's what the essence of that issue is, that there are truths there, but there's also falsehoods.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's true. It would be great if on some kind of a grand scale, we could all, as churches, agree and say, look, we don't agree with everything that happens in your church. We don't like the way you do things. We don't agree with your preferences. But on this level, on this 30,000-foot level, we're going to say we stand in solidarity. Mm-hmm. There have been movements like that, by the way.
Yeah, there's the ecumenical movement, which we never really talked about.
Exactly.
That's a big deal.
And there's a response to the ecumenical movement, which was the American Council of Christian Churches, the ACCC. And I think that there's even now there's a wider branch of that's international. And that was a multi-level group of people, very, very conservative, very, very fundamental. They were Presbyterians, and they were Baptists, and they were Bible churches, and what they said was, we're agreed on this level, and on this level, this 30,000-foot level, if you will, we're going to partner, and we're going to focus our attention on the things that are important. When it comes down to grassroots and so on, we recognize that we're just so different, and we have just such different preferences that we can't function together on a local level.
Right. So if you remember back to the illustration we used at the outset of this discussion with that bullseye idea, so with the centering being those core beliefs, those core principles that we've now identified as the fundamentals, and then the second ring being that conviction ring, where there are differing opinions on things that are scriptural. So like in as an illustration I use often there, our church baptizes believers who have, made a profession of faith. Other churches will baptize infants as a dedication to the faith. And so we have a conviction difference, but because of our core cohesion,
right?
We would still call those people brothers and sisters. We just meet in different buildings on Sundays, and that's okay.
Right.
And then the outer ring is the preference ring. And in those preference rings, we can say, like, some of these things we can just continue to get along with inside the same church building on a Sunday morning, and some of these preferences, maybe not. And we've kind of, we weigh those a bit sometimes. And sometimes those divisions are good, and sometimes those divisions, have proved to not be so good.
Right.
So the ecumenical movement, many of you listening have heard that term, aren't necessarily familiar with it. If you're part of our church and have gone through our church, read through our constitution as in our church, there's actually verbiage that prohibits being involved with the ecumenical movement. Why is that? Why would a church say, actually have a statement saying we're not involved with this?
So the ecumenical movement is a movement that begins to say, why can't we all just get along? And looking for some kind of cohesive level, rather than going to a cohesion of, we trust Jesus Christ as our Savior, we believe the Bible to be truth, and it's going to guide us in our direction. What the ecumenical movement did was, hey, you know what? We're all Protestants, and we all need to love one another. Mm-hmm. So love is a great motivator, and it's a great uniter. But it leaves out so much, and it lets so much in.
Sure, because we talked about that in our previous episode. You have, because the definition of love is can be fluid, then it makes the statement really wishy-washy and challenging.
Absolutely.
And so, because of that, you end up being partnered with people that you wouldn't share even the same core values with.
Right.
And I think on top of that, right, some of the ecumenical movement things that I've seen, they're even broader than Protestantism.
Yes.
Yes. You'll have Jewish rabbis on the same platform and imams and things like that, and that would all be ecumenical.
We all get along,
right? Because we're all, it's that coexist bumper sticker is the ecumenical movement,
right?
And so then the response to that was, from a lot of evangelicalism is well, that totally bypasses these fundamentals that we all agree on. So, but can we still take the heart of that? And then that's where the lots of C's comes from.
There's another one, which is the National Association of Evangelicals, the NAE. Mm-hmm. That is not as strong of a program as the others, but that whole idea really is, what is our core value?
Right.
And if in mainline Protestantism, all they have that they say is a core value is this concept of loving others as Jesus loved us, well, that's a great biblical principle, but it's not a core value. That's actually trying to unite on something very fluid, something very much on the edge of the target. So, you could say, well, hey, we're at least on the target, but are you really? And that's one of the reasons why we as a church have said we don't want anything to do with the with the ecumenical movement.
Right. Which is not to say that we want nothing to do with other churches.
Absolutely.
Which can be a problem.
Sure.
Some people will read that and say, okay, then we just don't connect with any other church in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And that would be a wrong interpretation of that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to get to today, we've hit this time period. Oh,
okay.
You have
I have one other idea, okay? And that is, so that whole idea of I stay away from the ecumenical movement, but you're right, it doesn't mean that we stay away from other churches. The hard thing there is something that came out in the 40s. Who do I associate with? So I might associate with another church that is just like mine and has the same core values, maybe a couple of different differences, same core values. But what do I do with a church that has similar core values to mine, but they have an ongoing relationship with a church that has no core values that I have in common?
So it's like this, you can't be associated with a church because of who they are associated with.
Right.
Wow. So it's like a whole extra step on that one.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of the issue of do I have a let's put it into perspective. Let's say that church contacts me and says, "Hey, we're going to have an evangelical crusade. Mm-hmm. We're actually going to put up a tent like in the old days. We're gonna have people come. We've got music. We've got an evangelist coming in. He's going to speak. It's going to be really great. And we've invited you to participate with us, and we've also invited the First Mainline Church in town because we have a relationship with them too. And at that point, if you've made the decision, well, I don't really want to have anything to do with the ecumenical movement. Do you say, brother, I would love to be part of your evangelical work and your evangelistic work, but because First Mainline is part of that, I really don't feel like we're all working in the same direction. And you can have a friendship with people that are at First Mainline. If you're a pastor, you can go to drink coffee with the pastor at First Mainline. The moment you say, from Proverbs, let's throw in and have a common purse. At that point, you begin to get into really, really difficult territory.
Yeah. Okay. So this challenge arises, and so far, I mean, we've hit. Hopefully, as you're listening to this, you're hearing kind of how all of these things are unfolding. And today, we want to get to this point of being able to get at this question of why can't we get along, and today I want to talk a little bit more about the things that have divided the church that aren't necessarily good things that have divided the church. I feel like so far we've talked about all of these divisions that come naturally and out from a healthy place and a desire to follow Scripture and a desire to follow the Lord. And it feels like to me that when we get into the last 50 years of the church movement, that there are more divisions over things that aren't necessarily healthy or biblically mandated divisions. And that might just be because of my experience being alive more often in the last 50 years than in the previous 250. But it seems like we have some of those divisions that have arisen in the last 50 years. And so with these things, I think, as we talk about them, we can kind of define what they are and talk through the history of some of these bad divisions. And I would say that these might be things that the church has a responsibility to repent over and to pursue reconciliation on. But so we've set the stage for that. And so the first one of these that I'm aware of, it actually has a term, right? And that's called like the worship wars.
Right.
The worship wars. It moves out of this. Now we've moved out of the conviction ring. And we're in the preference ring, and we have some churches that have a certain worship style, and then you have other churches that sing other songs, and you start to divide and actually call, you actually would, divide as a church over your decision on what to sing every Sunday, even if you preach from the same passage with the same message later on.
So I have a history view here.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Kind of like, I like to say of myself that I'm a perspectivist. I have this, I call it a blessing of actually being able to put my historical life in perspective and use it to understand my present. So when I was a child, I went to a fundamentalist church. We sang hymns on Sunday mornings. You can test me. I know the hymnal. I know it really, really well. I'm not just a first verse guy. I can usually even sing the dreaded third verse.
Wow, the one nobody touches.
Yeah. So I had that experience, but we also had junior church and Sunday school, and in those sessions, in those parts of the church, we would actually sing a lot of Bible choruses. They were there was a guy named Percy Crawford at the time who was writing Bible choruses. There was a movement led by a guy named Jack Wurtson in New York called Word of Life, and Word of Life wrote Bible choruses, and the chorus method or the chorus concept was so significant that advertisers looked at Christian choruses and said, if we want people to remember our name and our product, we need to have the character of this Christian music, these Christian choruses, because their words are memorable because of the way they link with the music.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up on hymns in church and choruses everywhere else. Now, fast forward that 10 years, the 1970s, my youth pastor his wife actually played the guitar.
Sure, during the Jesus movement. And,
Yeah. Shout out to Jim and Joy Westervelt. They're still in ministry, right? So they played guitar and sang. And at first there was a great deal of tension in the church because of a guitar on the platform. And that tension was only overcome by the fact that Jim and Joy were such good vocalists that no one really cared about the fact that she was playing the guitar. But that introduced guitar music in our church, and that was difficult because we were an organ, piano, and 45-voice choir in robes type of church. And suddenly there was that tension. It was even starting in the 70s. Fast forward to...
Well, I mean, even before you fast forward there, right? Like that's happening in your church, but it's also happening in pop culture.
That's true.
Because, in the 1950s, you have these musicians that are singing gospel songs. It's going out on the radio and out on record and out on vinyl. And these musicians have their roots in church music, and start using some of the principles of church music and the design of church music. And then they start singing about girls instead of Jesus. And then you have guys like Buddy Holly and Elvis.
Elvis's number one selling album was his hymns album.
Yeah, you have Ray Charles coming out of the South, and you have in the country scene you've got like June Carter and all of those people, right?
That's right.
Who and they're all singing. They all have their roots in church music, led by guitar. So that when you get through the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s. You begin the Jesus movement, where you have these musicians whose lives have been changed by an interaction with the gospel, who are taking their gift set and writing new music. And you got like Bob Dylan, who brings in some of the best musicians in the world to make a gospel album. He tricks them into coming and playing on this gospel record, becomes a huge selling record, and all of these musicians walk away going, "It's great music. I'm never going to believe in your Jesus." But then you have a movement in pop culture that's influenced by these praise songs that come out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
But you also have a geographic culture issue here too, because it's acceptable in the South for guitarists singing country music songs to sing country gospel songs, to sing those on a Sunday morning. That music changes from country gospel to American folk music and comes to the platforms of churches in the North, and there is resistance.
Yeah, and it's fine for your kids programs. It's tolerable in your teenage programs. But on a Sunday morning on the platform, we're going to stick with our piano, organ, and choir. But the problem is, all of those children and teenagers grow up.
Yes, exactly. I remember having a conversation with my secretary many years ago. She was in her 70s, and she hated the choruses that we're singing in our church. And I looked at her and I said, "Well, this is your fault." And her eyes got huge, like, "What do you mean this is my fault?" And I said, "When I was in junior church, people your age taught me choruses, like I mentioned, the Percy Crawford choruses. You guys taught us that. So isn't it just natural that my generation coming into church is going to want to sing the music that you taught us to sing?"
Sure. Yeah. And the hard part here in this brewing fight is that I think we're really bad at understanding our history, and we're really bad at understanding where our music comes from, especially. And so what that generation was calling hymns had been fought over previously.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, I read an article by Cliff Barrows one time. And for those of you newbies, Cliff Barrows was the song leader for Billy Graham for most of the years of his ministry. So for those of you who are aren't acquainted with the Billy Graham Crusade, Cliff Barrows would lead the singing. He would also lead the choir. They would bring in people could volunteer to join the choir, and there'd be like 100-voice choir behind Billy. And they would also, their soloist, their primary soloist was also a guy named George Beverly Shea, who made a song from Sweden very, very popular in our culture. And it was a song that was not in the hymnals prior to George Beverly Shea singing it. But, because George Beverly Shea would sing How Great Thou Art at the Billy Graham Crusades, hymnals had to be reprinted to put How Great Thou Art in because it was not part of our hymnody. Anyway, Cliff Barrows, writing in this article, talks about how the churches in the 50s and the 60s would come to Billy Graham and to him and would complain because the Billy Graham Crusade was not emphasizing the great hymns of the faith. And because of that, there were churches that were struggling with participating with Billy Graham because his music was not what they wanted. It wasn't the hymnody that they were expecting.
Right, which creates division in the church, because this is the Billy Graham Crusade movement is massive. It comes on, we've talked about this already, it comes on the tails of great crusades before, from Moody and Billy Sunday, but Billy Graham, this is next level life change. And we talked about that previously. I mean, exactly. The man is leading services for the Queen of England.
Right.
The whole, and some of these great musicians we talked about whose lives were changed in the 70s are on the platform with him when he does these crusades. Johnny Cash goes up and sings with
Chris Christopherson.
Yes. Yeah. And they're up there, they'll sing together, and then Johnny Cash heads off to prison. But they're there.
Yeah.
And they're, again, love Jesus, working through this old man, new man stuff. But that music is changing rapidly, but the local church is now in conflict. Can we support the Billy Graham Crusade, which has so many people coming to Christ?
And, I mean, the Billy Graham Crusade has its issues. Let's be really honest here, right? That whole who am I having on my leadership team? We talked about that a little bit. The whole evangelicals,
out of the 40s,
and Billy would go after mainline churches. He would invite the local Episcopalian pastor to bring out his church, and he would invite the local mainline Presbyterian church to bring out, and he would invite the local Roman Catholic priest to bring out his church, and part of that was. Billy Graham was focused on saving souls.
Right.
So why
would I refuse some souls from coming?
Yeah. And it's just a problem because, of course, then you're going to have that spiritually dead Episcopalian pastor or Episcopalian bishop leading in prayer at one of the crusades, and that just makes the evangelicals scratch their head and say, man, I don't know if I want to be associated with somebody who in his writings has said, I don't believe God exists, and yet here he is at a Billy Graham crusade leading.
And so if I go and bring my church to this, all my congregants are going to say, there's going to be trust issues with what we've been teaching.
Here's that question, right? What's the difference between us and the local mainline church?
Yeah.
Because we saw them at the Billy Graham crusade and they seemed to be doing okay.
They were there. They were praying. They were singing. They were in the hallways of the arena praying as people, with people as they accepted Jesus. Why are we all that different? Why can't we get along?
Right.
And as a pastor, you're saying, oh, let me count the ways that we are different.
Right.
But it's such an awkward conversation to have with your parishioner.
Sure.
Or your congregant, depending on where you're from.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
It's a real challenge that the church has here, because some of these things, some of these natural divisions that we've talked about so far, now with the Billy Graham Crusade, are becoming really challenging. And then on top of that, you're having this music movement that is changing pop culture and church culture, and churches are having to deal with all of this.
And you realize that the music issue isn't just evangelicals,
Right.
right? It's mainline churches too that are struggling with a lot of the chorus music, a lot of the evangelical, a lot of the even the Fanny Crosby and P.P. Bliss stuff that's being introduced. Because here's the thing: those songs are testimonies, and I would say, a lot of what we love as hymns aren't necessarily truly hymns.
They're just in the hymn book.
They're testimony songs.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a difference between a testimony song and a hymn. And I think that we see that in a lot of Christian choruses. A testimony song tells a person about the singer's experience with Christ, and that's a great thing. A hymn teaches a biblical concept. Mm-hmm. So there's that issue, and the evangelicals and even the mainliners are saying, "Hey, wait a second. There's not a lot of Christian principle being taught in this music that you're calling a hymn."
Yeah.
Right, and that just creates dissonance. Music word.
Yeah, I like that. Good job.
And it's not just a problem there. Can I just really quick identify that there are even personal and denominational issues that arise with the whole music wars thing. For example, if you're a Presbyterian, if you're an old line Presbyterian, if you remember what being a Presbyterian was like in the 60s and the 70s, Presbyterian churches do not focus their worship on music. Mm-hmm. They don't have as many hymns included in their worship, and the music that they do include all has to link back to the book of Psalms in some way.
Right.
They sing the Psalter, and the Presbyterian hymn book is called a Psalter. So it's fun to look at one of those. They don't put titles in the Psalter on any of the hymns. You might look at that and say, this looks like an old hymn of the faith, but this looks like Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress. Isn't that great? It doesn't have the title on the top of the song. It'll have a number, mm-hmm. and it'll have a psalm that music can be connected to. Mm-hmm. But it won't have the title of it, and you have to look all the way down to the bottom of the page in the hymnal to find out who wrote it and who wrote the music for it. Mm-hmm. Because for the Presbyterians, music isn't important.
Right. It's the word that is important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
and you have some Presbyterian churches even that won't use instrumentation.
None.
All the singing is a cappella, so you're only singing songs. You're singing them without instruments.
Right.
So now you're in
that
real
includes
challenge.
The church. By the way, there's another group called the Church of God out of Cleveland, Tennessee, and they also do not use any instruments in their worship services.
Right.
So imagine, if you will, you are somebody who's been converted from a deep mainline Presbyterian background, and you now are starting at a Bible church, Baptist church, gospel church, where Assembly of God church, mm-hmm. where music is 40 to 50% of the service, where your musicality is very much celebratory. It's lifting up music. You're talking about maybe the writer of the music. You're playing it with multiple instruments. If you come from that background where music is not the priority, you are very uncomfortable in that kind of an experience.
Yeah, and I think the discomfort you start to whenever we're uncomfortable, we start to think about like what would make us comfortable, and then we assign value to what makes us comfortable. And and rather than just thinking about it objectively. It's really hard to be objective. And so then you start to say, well, then my experience says that the dissection of the word is the most important piece of what we do as a church and in our service. And so since this other experience now puts so much emphasis on its music, then they are devaluing the proclamation of the word and rising up the value of music, which is man's word and not God's word. And now you can add like spiritual value to your discomfort and start to like, wag your finger at the other group saying you are wrong and you don't value God because this is different.
Absolutely. So here's another aspect of this, right? Then you add in what many call the charismaticizing of Christian music.
Right. Yeah.
There are a lot of people, for example, that I know of who are older than me, thankfully, who have a hard time with choruses that repeat the same line over and over and over again. Which I was in a restaurant this weekend, and I heard an old 60s tune, and I turned to my wife and I said, "Do you realize that entire song that lasted 2.5 minutes had one line that was repeated over and over and over again?" It just becomes monotonizing, and there it was a Christian style of music very similar to that, where he would repeat a line over and over and over again, and to some extent, the purpose of that was to create an emotional relationship with the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of people who struggled with that. A lot of people in evangelical circles who struggled with, why am I repeating this one line over and over again?
There's no content here.
Right.
There's no value.
Right. They would often quote from the Sermon on the Mount and say, this is vain babbling.
Yeah. Or is it the 7/7 songs, right? 7 words repeated 7 times. Yeah. And and it would be like this disparaging comment, right? Because CCM, contemporary Christian music, is now a thing.
Yes,
and
it's a moneymaker,
a huge moneymaker. And a lot of the CCM musicians are coming out of a charismatic background.
Exactly.
And the charismatic background has always valued the emotional response to the Holy Spirit, which is a good thing, to value the emotional response to the Holy Spirit. That maybe some of us more conservative evangelicals lack in our faith experience, but they because they're more comfortable trading in that space, they have written music out of that, and they're more prepared to write music. It's already a piece of their church culture. And so when the Christian music scene takes off and there is a hunger for more, then you go to these musicians who have already been doing this, which are largely coming out of a charismatic world. And so now you're copying and pasting songs written by charismatics and sung in old Baptist churches. And people are starting to struggle a lot here.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think there's been a change in contemporary Christian music in probably the last 10 years, I would say. It was foreshadowed. It probably was foreshadowed 20 years ago. But I think one of the things that I have seen happening in contemporary Christian music that we use in our churches, and put this into perspective too. I don't want to disparage Christian radio, especially musical Christian radio. There's one of those at a satellite station, and there's several others. They tend to those Christian radio stations tend to do two things. One is they target the middle of the road, mm-hmm. because that's where they're going to get the most listeners. And then the second thing is that they are very broad in what they call Christian music. And a lot of what is on the radio has no place in church.
Right.
Because one of the things I despise as a pastor,
Ooh, this will be fun,
is Christian music that is totally pronoun driven.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it talks about he,
Right.
not Jesus. It talks about he.
Who is he?
Who is he? And when you listen to the song, it sounds like, well, this is a great love song. Is it a great hymn? Is it a great Christian inspiration? Does it have testimony to it? And I don't necessarily see that. I see it as this guy would love to break into country music or would love to break into pop music, and he's written a love song and he can get it played on Christian stations, but he can't necessarily get it he can't get necessarily a spin on a pop channel. Mm-hmm. So I really despise those. Those have very little place in church.
Right, which I would say, like, there are, because the Christian music world has refined quite a bit and I'm curious, actually, I circle back to this. When you say 10 years ago, what year are you referring to?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm actually going back.
Like year 2000, actually 20 years ago?
Yeah, I would go back to
changing?
the year 2000.
Yeah.
I think I saw a change somewhere around there.
Yeah, I agree on that. So I would say, like, as the Christian music scene has refined, I actually think it's a healthy thing to have music that doesn't have any place in the church that's still Christian.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And that's a great thing, right? Like,
right.
You don't have to, like, pull every single song off of K-Love and then move it to your Sunday morning service.
Please.
Actually, I would really struggle with that. I'm challenged to listen to K-Love. So it's just as a pastor, we're being honest with our friends
we
here,
are.
right?
Yeah.
Like I struggle with K-Love because of all the middle of the road stuff, and it bothers me musically. But I'm grateful for it, and I'm glad that it exists, and I'm glad the songs that are written and played there exist, because there's definitely a space for that in our world.
But Butterfly Kisses does not belong.
No, but all of those things, like, somebody just got really offended. So all of those, I'm glad that all of those exist. They don't necessarily need to exist in the church. But that comes out of refinement in the media,
right?
In that form of media, which is
right.
great. But when this started, all of these songs, you're either singing a hymn or you're singing a praise chorus, and on the same Sunday morning, you're as a church, like as a leader in a church, like I might have a heart to reach my community. And if you read, there's some great books that happen, in the 90s about church growth. And there are some great churches that come out of the 80s and 90s that explode in popularity and in size. You have Southern California, you've got Saddleback up in Chicago, you have Willow Creek down in Atlanta, you have North Point, and you have some of these churches that just explode in size, that are led by men who love Jesus and come from an evangelical background. And some of you are listening, you're like, yeah, but I really dislike this guy. It's fine. Like their heart was good, and their heart is good. And we would call them brothers for sure. And but they start playing more music that would be found on the radio stations of their communities. And they're writing songs that sound like the music that their target audience would listen to.
So Rick Warren tells a story.
And in doing that, the
right?
churches explode because people are connecting better with that music.
Right. So Rick Warren tells a story. He's Saddleback's getting started. He has maybe 250 people meeting in his tent. And one Sunday, he just hands out a piece of paper to everybody in the tent and says, write down the call letters of the radio station that you listened to in the car. And they collected them. And what they found was that the vast majority of the people that attended that church listened to the local pop rock station. Mm-hmm. Of course they did. That's
why it's pop.
Yeah, exactly. So he went out and found a musician. He said his first full-time hire was a worship pastor, a guy named Rick Munchell, who came in and he said, Rick, here's the music that we need. It needs to be pop rocky because this is who our congregation is. And that's how they expanded their music. Their music addressed the culture that they were looking at.
Yeah. It starts from a missionary heart. And which, again, like, I think the same thing, you see the same thing in the Billy Graham movement. You have this missionary heart that writes new music. But then the people who have already been in the club for a long time, they're missing out on the music that they've adored and sung that has been meaningful to them. And this conflict, it continues to evolve. And so you have these churches, and the criticism of these churches that are growing rapidly. I mean, Saddleback has like 100,000, 200,000 people associated with it.
It's large,
huge churches, right? As these churches expand, like you start to like, the old faithful start going, yeah, they're like a mile wide, but they're only an inch deep and we start like referring to some of these music choices as the reasons for why they are like that. And it's not because it's a church that's just massively full of brand new believers who need mature ones to be there to build into them.
Right.
And so you start to say, like, there is this like club mentality that evolves, like, because these new people aren't the same as, like, they're not coming to Jesus the same direction I came to Jesus. And so since they're not coming to Jesus in the same direction that I came to Jesus, I've got a problem with them. And we land back in Galatians.
Exactly. Yeah.
As a church.
Yeah, because now we've set up a rule regarding what your music is supposed to look like. Did you ever see the old movie, The African Queen?
Yeah, Humphrey Bogart.
Katharine Hepburn. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a scene there with leeches. It's absolutely disgusting and kind of scary how they could do that in the 1950s. But anyway, the start of that, and remember, I'm referring to something that's Hollywood, so it's definitely anything coming out of Hollywood is anti-Christian. Just keep that in mind. Every once in a while, a blind squirrel finds an acorn, and they hit on this. So one of the things that, if you've never seen the story, read the book by C.S. Forrester, the storyline is of this woman who's the sister of a missionary. They're missionaries in Africa as World War I is beginning. And in the opening scene, Katharine Hepburn, the missionary's sister, is playing the organ in a church with the brother leading the singing of a large African congregation who is kind of they're not really singing, but they're singing. They're just kind of mouthing the words. Well, the war hits, the brother gets killed, and the entire congregation goes running into the bush, back to all that they ever were. They almost leave Christianity. And they go back, and the way they make that clear is that they start singing their old music. And I don't want to make this issue like a Sketch Erickson thing from the 70s or 80s, where we say that, music is of the devil or something like that.
Burn your albums.
Music is all music is good if it's used to please God. So all music can be good if it's used to please God. And one of the things that I see in that scene is that they failed in ministering to those locals to exegete their music and write music that they would understand and that they would sing in their voice that reflected their character and their culture and their love for Jesus.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so you fast forward from there into the actual practice of this in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you have ministries that are starting to figure out that this is an important element of doing of doing gospel work in their community, and but it's challenging the old guard. And in that challenge, you start to create these divisions. And so you might have a church that meets on one side of town that could, like, the message that pastor preaches could be copied and pasted exactly into the church on the other side of town.
Absolutely.
And both groups would be moved by it, but because they sing different songs on a Sunday, they are divided.
Right.
And this division, now we're getting into this like unhealthy division that we're seeing evolve, that we're repeating this pattern of unhealthy division that we see in Scripture, particularly in Galatians, of you're not coming to Jesus through Judaism, Because you're not coming to Jesus through Judaism, you're not a real Christian. So you've got to go get circumcised, and then you can be part of the club. We make that, you're not coming to Jesus through the old hymns. You're not singing the music that we've grown up with. You're singing this rock music. You have drums in here. It's loud. It's repetitive. And because you're singing all those things and you're not singing these hymns of the faith, you're not part of the club. And you need to come and fix your music, or else I'm out.
And what's crazy is, like Peter and Paul,
There's
both of us are getting together for lunch on a regular basis. Both of us pastors are getting, and we're praying for our congregations that they'll grow and expand.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
But the congregation has taken that preference division as a biblical division.
Right. And when you take that preference ring and you move that into the center of conviction, and even, further, you move that into core value. And now you've created something called legalism, where everything that a church decides, every opinion of the congregation is you're an in or an out person. Well, today's conversation about these divisions got a little bit long, and we thought maybe we should break this episode up into two. So you've just finished listening to part one of the conversation around those divisions that are unhealthy. We have more to come next week, so stay with us. Tune in next Monday, and you can hear part two of this conversation on unhealthy divisions. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.